Thanks again all for being here, especially thanks to our speaker for today, Dr. Jason Kilmer. Dr. Kilmer is an associate professor in psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the University of Washington and serves as an investigator on several studies evaluating prevention and intervention efforts for alcohol, marijuana, and other drug use by college students. In addition to research and teaching, he has worked extensively with college students and student groups around alcohol and other drug prevention programming and presentations throughout his career, including student athletes, fraternity and sorority members, residence life, and first-year students, both at UW and on campuses across the nation. Jason continues his direct work with students through presentations for intercollegiate athletics and residence life, and he also serves as the chairperson of Washington State's College Coalition for Substance Abuse Prevention. So we're so grateful to have someone with this background and expertise sharing with us today. Dr. Kilmer, thanks again for being here, and feel free to take it away.
Great, you're very welcome. And thank you to people that have joined. I feel like every time I have the chance to work with Sue, I say, I wish I could be there in person. And I'll say again, I wish I could be there in person. We love your state in this house. I say I'm at the University of Washington. That feels like a lie because I'm in the University of our dining room, where I've been for over 6 months now. But I always say I would fear the person that claims they have all the answers. That is not me. But what I've tried to do is address some of the topics that Sue asked me to talk about today. We will have time for questions. As is always the case, I just hope that this is as useful for all of you as possible. Do feel free to use the chat. This plays to none of my comforts in the sense that when I work with groups, I love interacting with people. I joke around a lot. It's brutal when you do a joke on a webinar and there's just silence because you don't know if you're just doing a horrible job or if people are laughing or whatever. So any input in the chat would certainly be greatly appreciated. I have a lot of slides to go through, and Sue, I guess I should have confirmed with you. I assume it's okay to send a PDF of these to you for the people if they want the handouts. Sue is nodding her head yes. So I'm going to talk a bit about not only what the science says related to cannabis, but as Sue asked that I could do, talk a bit just about kind of lessons learned in a state that's not only had a changing legal climate, but actively saw legislation change at the end of 2012. So I will go through all of that. Thanks to Sue for the invitation, and thanks for all of you for doing what you do at such a stressful time. We went remote on March 6th. That's when we got the email saying, bring home what you think you'll need, because on Monday, March 9th, we're going to be teaching virtually. And we kind of figured out what worked and what didn't work virtually. And all I ever tried to do is make sure that my presentations were still okay. But I got an email that it takes a special level of confidence in your own appearance to send this to someone. But I received this via email and was initially a little offended. I'm like, can you imagine being so confident with how you look to be like, well, you know who needs this? Jason. So I was like upset for like 5 seconds, and I'm like, well, I'm totally going to read it. So I read the article, and it said that the #1 thing to do is lighting. Lighting is critical. So on top of thanking Sue, I'd like to thank my co-presenter, Lampy, who's sitting right here. And the glow of Lampy has been really what's been getting me through the last 6 months. And he's one of 2 friends that I have at this point. So thanks, Lampy. I'm going to start not talking about cannabis. I'm a little embarrassed now that I know this is recorded, because probably not how I would have started a recorded presentation, but I'm going to start by talking about science, as evidenced by this slide that simply says science. There's more than one way to communicate a message. And I think that's true when it comes to public health. That's true when it comes to mask wearing in 2020. That's true when it comes to substance use. But it's also true when it comes to telling people to clean up after their pet. These are all pictures I personally took over the last year. In Boston, you can earn reading credit if you make it through this sign. Like, there's a lot going on in this sign. There's that really regal, well-behaved dog. Tons of info if you have the half hour to stop and read it. I saw a much cuter sign down I-5 in Oregon that said, "Dear dogs, please don't wander the playground." But the sign that I was obsessed with was this one I saw in British Columbia that showed a picture of a dog actively pooping. And I think the reason why I like this slide so much, this picture so much, is not because of the sign, but I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation that undoubtedly happened between the graphic designer and their boss. Because I want to believe the graphic designer was like, what do you think of the sign that I made? And their boss was like, we're going to need more poop. And the graphic designer was like, but I made a pile. And the boss said, show it falling. I feel like that's super unnecessary detail in that sign. Some signs need a bit more context. What's happening here? I saw this on vacation in December, and as I have two little brothers, and as the oldest of three, I promptly took a picture, texted my two little brothers. I said, this is proof that if you have more than one kid in a family, mom clearly has a favorite, which you've got to believe is the only logical conclusion to draw here. This was a sign by an elevator saying, hey, kid on the left, don't ride the elevator unattended. Be like the good kid on the right and hold a parent's hand. But if you're watching this and you are a sibling, you know what's up. And finally, it is true that some signs change your landscape of prevention. If you've landed at SeaTac Airport anytime the last couple of years and hung a left on International Boulevard as you head to Seattle, you're greeted by a sign. This is a sign that welcomes you to my state. It used to just be a sign for weed that said weed, cannabis, chill, it's legal, with the weekend chill highlighted. The state legislation said you can't have a billboard that's just for cannabis. It has to be for at least a store. So the sign came down, a store reinvested in it. So that continues to be the first sign you see upon arriving in the state of Washington. About a mile and a half from where I live, I'm pointing to where it is, it's over there, is this. This is not a cannabis retail store. This is a dog grooming store, now selling CBD for you and your pet. People that get really fired up about animal testing should probably get really fired up about this, because we don't have a lot of good research about what CBD does for people, let alone what it does to dogs. Yet, these are signs that again, add to and change your climate and what you do. So there were points to the signs that I showed you. This is a changing field, and this is a changing subject. I met with someone at 9 o'clock today who told me that they were really, really proud of the fact that they assessed thousands of students at their institution by asking the question about how often they smoke marijuana. And I said, I'm glad you have that question. Yet if someone does edibles every day, you've missed their daily cannabis use. And when we look at cannabis, there are many different ways of use. If people smoke, they're going to feel it pretty immediately. And their subjective sense of the high certainly varies based on how much they used, how potent what they used wound up being. If it's vaped, a vaporizer, potency tends to be higher, similarly will hit them immediately. If it's orally ingested, if it's brewed as a tea, if it's an infused drink, if it's the proverbial edibles, there's more of a lag. 30 to 60 minutes in the published literature. Our state stores warn people for the potential of a 2-hour lag. Think about how important that is. If people don't know about the lag, they eat a cookie, a brownie, a gummy, and they're like, I don't feel anything. So they eat a second one. They're like, really? I paid for this? They eat a third one. They could way overshoot or over, how high they intended to get. The concentrates do not occur in nature. The concentrates, the extracts, what people use for dabbing, hash oil, butter, shatter, these are also felt very immediately, and with that higher potency comes some additional concerns that we're trying to research as a field. If you are on this webinar and you're like, I got a lot to do today, I don't want to encourage anyone to leave early by any means, but if there's one takeaway, I really think we have to change the narrative. I hear so many people say, well, it's just weed. What's the big deal? I can look you through the glowing webcam and say it stopped being just weed decades ago. When I hear older adults say, well, I used when I was a kid and I turned out fine, you used different stuff. So the first thing, research has to play catch up on what people are actually using. If you orient the brain such that on the left of the slide is the front of the head, the right of the slide is the back of the head. THC is the most well-studied cannabinoid in cannabis. In distant second place is CBD. Other cannabinoids are virtually unstudied for their impact on people. Where does THC bind in the brain? All over the place. I can't graphically show a high any better than drawing your attention to the purple area that says reward pathway. THC binds all over the place. Memory, where the hippocampus is, shown in yellow, THC binds all over the place. Judgment, where the amygdala is, all over the place. So as THC potency changes, we have to be mindful of the effects of cannabis changing as well. This article came out in 2016, And it allows us to look over 2 decades in the United States at cannabis potency in cannabis that was seized by the Drug Enforcement DEA. And if you look at this article, along with Dr. Nora Volkov's 2014 article, it lets us estimate cannabis potency going back to the 1970s. When you hear about people in the 70s that, in their words, smoked grass, it's because it was practically grass. It was 1.5% THC. In the 80s, 2 to 3% THC. By 95, 4%. By 2001, 6%. By 2006, we cleared 8%. We've been double digits in potency in the United States since 2010. This came out in August of 2017. It's my state's second ever marijuana impact report. And when this was released, the average potency in the nation was a never before seen 13.18%. That's really, really strong. Never before seen until you come to my state. The average available for sale in the city of Seattle, 21.62%. I love research in a nerdy way, and I'm okay admitting that. If someone said to me for $10 million, what does the science say about Seattle weed in the human brain, the human body? First, good job for having $10 million. And second, we don't know. We do not know what cannabis of this potency does to people. We're starting to know, and we're starting to see a changing narrative in the scientific literature, and I'll get to that in just a bit. But I'd like to just draw your attention to even this graphic. This was a picture in the document where one pot store actually said, this is the range of what you can buy in smokable flower that people would put in a joint, a pipe. The low end was 11%, and you'll see why that matters in a bit. Hash oils, concentrates, what people use for dabbing. Nationwide in America, 55.85%. The average potency in Seattle is pushing 72%. So when people say it's natural, this doesn't occur in nature. When people say it's just weed, they're likely operating off of an old script, because this is a very different animal. In 2020, states that have legalized have seen potency go through the roof as the range of products changes as well. Why does potency matter so much? I only have an hour. I could talk about this stuff forever, and I will not do that. But this article came out in 2019, and it was the article we were waiting for. They said, we're not going to retroactively ask people dealing with mental health issues everything they've used. Instead, across 11 European cities and Brazil, as people were admitted to a hospital for first episode emergence of psychotic symptoms. So across the class of psychosis, there's a number of different diagnosable mental health issues, including schizophrenia, you name it. But what they found was people that used, they wanted to look at the likelihood of developing psychosis as a function of using what these researchers called the strong stuff. What did they call the strong stuff? Anything over 10% THC. I will remind you that in the United States, we're well above that. In my state, we're more than double what European researchers are calling the really, really strong stuff. People that used cannabis over 10% THC on a daily basis had a 5 to 6 times greater likelihood of developing psychosis than people who do not. I have a colleague that likes to point out this research is not correlated, this is causal. We can start making some pretty strong links here that there's something's going on with psychosis. This article came out in May, looked at the United Kingdom, looked at adolescents and young adults, and they looked at, yet again, the strong stuff. What did they call it? Anything over 10%. They showed increased risk of addiction, increased risk of generalized anxiety disorder. This came out also in 2020. For concentrates and extracts, there was more association with problematic use, being addicted, cannabis use disorder, and mental health disorders. You do such great work around prevention in your state. And I don't think it's a stretch at all to say that in 2020, we're more aware of anxiety, of depression, of mental health than we arguably have ever been. If someone says, I want to be a champion for mental health prevention, they also should be a champion for alcohol and other drug prevention. They should also be a champion for what we do about prevention around cannabis use. Because we're seeing that the potency of what people are using in 2020 is associated with more onset of things like mental health concerns and of addiction. The second thing is we've got to separate out placebo effects from pharmacological effects. When people say, well, when I use weed, I get more creative. Do you? Or is that an expectancy effect? When people say, well, it helps me unwind, does it? Or is that an expectancy effect? We know with alcohol, there are such strong expectancy effects on things like social functions. We've done research. Alan Marlatt at the University of Washington had and did research up until he passed away in a simulated bar where we tell people we're giving you alcohol, but then we give people alcohol-free drinks. What do we see them do? They get flirty, they get social, they get loud, they get talkative, even though they're drinking a non-alcoholic drink. Dr. Marlatt did the flip side where he'd tell people we're going to give you water, but actually give them alcohol, they don't act different. The physical effects kick in. They get tired, but they blame it on a long day of school or of work. They flush and they blame it on the temperature of the room. They get clumsy and they're like, sorry, clumsy. So people said, you've got to do this research with cannabis. This article by Laughlin and colleagues is amazing. They recruited people. They used at least once per month, up to multiple times per day. As it turned out, all but one person in their study used cannabis at least once per week, up to multiple times per day. These were folks that were a fan of cannabis. And they said, if I use, it makes me feel this, 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 this. They told people, you're going to be in a study where we either give you, you're going to be in one of three rooms. A room where we give you an edible that's just food, no THC, a low THC room, or a high THC room. They told people you need to use nothing at least 8 hours before you get here, since you have a 2 in 3 chance of getting a drug. Depending on which condition you're in, you're going to have to be here 1.5 to 6 hours. And once they were checked in, they were told, we're going to put you in cubicles, and for an hour, we're going to have you rate music and comedy clips, color designs, and compute math problems, which I'm not going to lie, after about 2 months of being locked in our house, that sounds like a super enjoyable afternoon right there. They walked into the room and said, all right, let's find out what condition you're in. And they would open up an envelope and say, well, you're in the high THC condition. Everyone applauded. They said, we're going to give you a lollipop. Now be careful. This is strong stuff. What did they give them? Hemp pops. What was the big catch? There was no high THC condition. There was no low THC condition. They only wanted to know if we tell people they're getting the strong stuff, but give them nothing, do they nevertheless report cannabis-related effects. Hemp pops are made with hemp seed oil. They have no active cannabinoids, glucose syrup, citric acid, sugar, natural flavors and colors, number 2 and number 5, which are the 2 most delicious colors. They said, finish the lollipop completely, and then we want you to rate your mood. We want you to rate how high you feel. And you're all seasoned veterans with this. You know that with edibles, there can be a lag. So we're going to have you rate your mood and how high you are again at the 30-minute mark and at the 60-minute mark. What did they find? There was a statistically significant decrease in negative mood with a lollipop. There was a statistically significant increase in people reporting that they felt high, even though they got nothing at all. Does cannabis do stuff? Yes. Does it do everything it's credited with? No way. And so much more research needs to be done, especially around medical uses. If you tell someone, hey, if you take this, it'll help with your blank, you've introduced the possibility for a placebo effect. And if Laughlin and colleagues' research has shown there are clear placebo effects on things like mood and even how high people feel, then we've got to expand research that looks at placebo effects so we can separate out what comes from the substance versus the belief that someone's used. So with that, I tried to pick, I'm a big fan of top 10 lists. I felt like top 10 would take longer than we had time for, so I picked 7 because that's super random and that seemed kind of like a good list. So I tried to pick 7 domains in no particular order, relevant to healthcare settings, counseling settings, prevention, intervention, honestly, school-based settings, you name it. Before I move on, Sue, I guess it's okay just to invite folks to type into the chat to see what comments there are, what questions there are, anything I can clarify at this point before we continue. Unless, Sue, you'd like me to just save questions till the end.
I think that's great. If we have any questions that anyone wants to pop in the chat now.
Sure, cool. I'll pause for a second, see if there are any questions or comments so far. Nothing so far, so I'll keep meeting. What's holding back the research? I mean, a lot of this is challenging, especially research on medical uses. When you look at DEA scheduling, cannabis is a Schedule I illicit drug, which means according to the DEA, there are no medically indicated uses. So when people say we want to do a really well-controlled study, you're not going to be able to use federal funding for things like that. So that's one of the challenges. I know that one of the challenges in my state has been having research dollars be available for work like this. We just have so much catch up we have to play as a field and in general.
Is there anybody here that has a question?
All right, I'll go ahead and keep moving. So here's my 7. Number 7, impact on attention, concentration, and memory. I work with college students, and if someone said you can only show one slide to college students, I would probably show them this one. The part of the brain that, among other things, is associated with affecting attention, concentration, and memory is the hippocampus. Truly long story short, after cannabis use, the neurons in the hippocampus get suppressed. What does that mean? They fire, but they fire at a rate that's lower and slower than they could or should be firing. Harrison Pope is a researcher in the 90s who said, I want to test this with college students. And I don't want to get them crazy high and make them take a test. I want people to use weed, and I want to test them a day later, 24 hours later. What did Dr. Pope show? 24 hours after use, there were measurable decreases in attention, concentration, and memory. And the more heavily people typically used, the more pronounced those decreases were. Dr. Pope showed 2 things that scientists had never shown before. 1, a full day after use, you can still see the effect of someone's use. Think about what that means. If someone has a drink today, we have no proof of that tomorrow. If someone uses cannabis, we can measure the impact cognitively a day later. Second, the fact that the more heavily people typically use, the more pronounced this seemed to be. Now, scientists said, that's amazing. Critics said, this doesn't prove anything. It's not causal. What if people who struggle with attention tend to be attracted to using cannabis? So Dr. Pope said, that's fair. Ethically, we can't take people who don't use and make them start. So what if we take people who use every day and we have them quit? And we pay them every day they stay clean. If we follow people over time and their cognitive abilities stay the same, yeah, maybe they were there to start with. But if their cognitive abilities, if they start to abstain, and as they abstain, their cognitive abilities start to improve, that, my friends in Montana, is causal. It takes 4 weeks, but 28 days after stopping daily cannabis use, there are no longer any significant differences in attention, concentration, and memory compared to a control group of people that don't use weed at all. Down in San Diego, Susan Tapert's lab, she looked at a sample of 15 to 19-year-olds who used every other day. It took 2 weeks of abstinence for verbal learning to match that of 15 and 19-year-olds who don't use. Verbal working memory took 3 weeks. Attention takes the full 4 weeks. If someone says, I have ADHD, and I really want to do well in school, I'm being treated for it, then marijuana is the worst possible fit. We know of no substance more associated with causing attention decreases, let alone exacerbating existing ones. If someone says, I wonder if I have ADHD, can I have Adderall? And they're using cannabis, we can't pretend to diagnose if they do or don't have an attention issue if they're using a substance that causes attention decreases. So especially for those of you who work with students, you know your students best. If someone says, my goal is to do well in school, and they are doing well, awesome. If they say, I wish I was doing better, but my memory is terrible, and I really struggle with attention, and I can't concentrate, especially with all these Zoom classes, and they're using marijuana, that's causal. And if someone stops using cannabis, you will see that pay dividends in their cognitive abilities. Number 6, academic outcomes. My friend Amelia Ari at the University of Maryland is senior author on this amazing paper. This link will be in your handouts. It says of all the problems that contribute to dropping out, substance use is one of the easiest to identify and one of the most easily stopped by interventions, including treatment. Research evidence shows that when adolescents stop substance abuse, academic performance improves. Substance using students are at increased risk for academic failure, including dropout. Now, we know that's true with both alcohol and cannabis, but this report showed that marijuana has a stronger negative relationship to GPA and other outcomes and risk for dropout than alcohol use. What does that mean? That as cannabis use goes up, GPA goes down. So it's true for both, but it's an even more pronounced relationship with cannabis. Quoting directly from the report, the more severe the substance use, the more likely the impact on academic performance and risk for dropout. When you look at people once they get to the level of a college campus, Amelia shown with college students that the more frequently students use marijuana, the more that's associated with discontinuous enrollment, not dropping out, but stopping out, losing credit, taking quarters or semesters off, skipping more classes, and lower GPAs. Swerkin and colleagues showed that any marijuana use compared to students without is associated with lower grade point average. And if you follow people over time, those that dig a pretty deep hole and get behind but nevertheless decrease, and those that keep using frequently over time are less likely to still be enrolled and less likely to graduate on time. Think of the very important conversations happening in your state and in my state about how we make college more affordable for people. That's an important conversation to be having. And the truth is, the science is showing the more heavily and more frequently people are using, the less likely they are to graduate on time if they even make it to graduation. So when you hear people say, if you look at what I mentioned on these slides, if you've got folks in your community saying, I want to be a champion for academic outcomes, I'm rooting for our kids in our community, then again, you also have to be a champion for alcohol and other drug prevention. Because what you do about prevention absolutely will pay dividends in the classroom. Bolin and colleagues showed that among college students who drink and use weed, they're both associated with lower grade point average. But much like Amelia's report with high school students and younger, that if you stick them in the same statistical regression explaining variance, marijuana is driving that ship. The effects of alcohol become non-significant. To end on a positive note, while it's concerning that Maida and colleagues showed students using both marijuana and alcohol at moderate to high levels had lower GPAs over 2 years, those that make a change in their substance use do better. So in particular, if people are saying we really are rooting for the kids in our community, again, then get on board with alcohol and other drug prevention, because there's such a clear link, especially on today's topic, between cannabis use and academic outcomes, that we have to be aware of that. When we ask students, hey, what gets in the way of doing in school the way you want to do? This comes from the National College Health Assessment from the American College Health Association. This was done with over 30,000 schools students at 58 schools in fall of 2019. Remember fall 2019? They asked students, here are 51 possible things that could get in the way of how you're doing in school. Check all that apply. So what do we know from the very clear science? These things are affected. When you ask students what gets in the way of doing the way you want to do, cannabis use is in 40th place out of 51 possible factors. What do they say gets in the way? Putting stuff off, stress, anxiety, and sleep. Let's keep that list of stress, anxiety, and sleep in mind, because we're going to look at this. I got a question in the chat asking, is memory loss permanent? That's research that needs to be done. There's research with rats that show damage to the hippocampus over time. That research would need to be translated to work we do with people. So far, the research has shown that when people use and stop, you do see that improvement. There's been one study. Everything I'm showing you, there's more than one study. And I say that because it's, when we've presented single studies, people have been like, well, that hasn't been replicated. All right, fair enough. And you know, the perfect study, the perfect soul study doesn't exist. There is one study that was done in New Zealand and Australia, where they followed people over 25 years. Wrap your head around how impressive a study that is. They recruited people when they were 13. They followed them till they were 38 years of age. People that were chronic, heavy cannabis users at each time point lost 8 IQ points over time. And that's not recoverable. Has that research been replicated? No. Does it need to be? Probably. Will it take 25 years to replicate? Also true. So to answer the question, there is one study that suggests that there may be something going on when people start using young and keep it that way and stay very frequent in their use. But so much more of that research would need to be done. I'll continue with where I left off with that question. So stress, anxiety, and sleep problems. Number 5 is sleep. We get lots of mixed messages. This is an article that ran on the front page of the Seattle Times, March 9th, 2017. 10 types of marijuana that will help you sleep like a baby. With no disrespect to this article, they had not conducted a literature review and found the article by Angarita and colleagues that showed absolutely what we know is that cannabis impacts sleep quality. So when people say, I feel like I fall asleep faster, that's true. They will fall asleep faster after cannabis use. It's a sedative hypnotic. Sedative means sedating, hypnotic means sleep inducing. If you want to see the perfect night's sleep, it's this graph. Rapid eye movement sleep, REM sleep, where we do our dreaming. Your time in REM should be getting longer, longer, longer. In non-REM, the most well-known is stage 4 or deep sleep, that should be getting less, less, and less. The students I work with will say, I feel like 2 things happen when I use weed at night. I sleep hard. I sleep and I mean it. And don't dream. What they're calling sleeping hard, Angarita and colleagues showed with stage 4 extension. Time spent in deep sleep gets extended. Why aren't they dreaming? Because the brain waves needed to kick into REM don't happen. What's the impact of a night of REM deprived sleep? Increases the next day in being tired, daytime sleepiness. Increases in anxiety, irritability, jumpiness. Use every night, this is additive, this is cumulative. If this is one isolated night, the next night the body plays catch up. A person goes through REM rebound sleep, which on the front end of the night is associated with difficulty both falling and staying asleep. Once they get to sleep, vivid, weird dreams, increase the next day in fatigue. What were among the top 4 barriers to college students, self-identified barriers to academic success? Stress, sleep problems, and anxiety. All of those things could be caused by nighttime cannabis use. They certainly could be made worse or exacerbated by nighttime cannabis use. Factors associated with health and mental health. One of the most cited articles in our field, Hall and Degenhart, 2009, they showed that the work of prevention specialists from a mental health standpoint is essential. They showed that those that used cannabis 10 or more times by the age of 18 were 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. In fact, they said that the data on this were clear enough that 13% of schizophrenia cases could go away if cannabis use went away. What are we doing in some of our communities? We're increasing access to cannabis use. I had the honor of running a webinar that Dr. Hall spoke for in 2013. It was months after we legalized in Washington. And I said to him, if there's one thing we could do on college campuses in my state, what would it be? And his answer surprised me. He said, I would absolutely screen for being addicted for cannabis use disorder in your counseling and health centers. And I said, wow, I did not think you'd say that. I said, why? He said, we don't know what comes first and we don't know what drives what, but we see a scary 3-way interaction between depression, being addicted to cannabis, and suicide. Such that if someone is willing to say, I need help for depression, and they flag as being addicted, he said that person poses a suicide risk to you that we cannot explain. He said, if you have a waiting list, do not put them on the waiting list. They become #1 priority for assignment to a provider. This will be in your handouts if any of you are joining this as someone in a position professionally to screen. The gold standard that Dr. Hall recommended is the Cannabis Use Disorders Identification Test Revised. It starts with a single yes, no. Have you used any cannabis over the past 6 months? If no, you're done. If yes, there's 8 questions. And it will let you know who potentially flags for being at risk for addiction. I said to him, I'm so blown away by that statement. And he said, well, look at your own country's research. He's in Australia. So I did, because I'm super compliant and I love looking at data, because again, total nerd about science. And the National Survey of Drug Use and Health from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. This is not college students. This is all adults in our country. And the bluish purple bar, all adults. Green bar, any past year cannabis use. These are not necessarily causal, but notice that serious thoughts of suicide, 2.5 times greater if people say I used marijuana in the last year. Making a suicide plan, 2.5 times greater. Attempting suicide is 3 times greater. I said, wow, I checked it out. You were right. And he said, I didn't tell you just to look at past year use. I told you to look at past year addiction. I was like, come on, Jason, be a good student. So I looked at past year addiction. It tells an even more compelling story. And this is any past year substance use disorder compared to adults without. Serious thoughts of suicide, 4 times greater. Making a suicide plan, 4.5 times greater. Attempting suicide, 5.5 times greater. I'll say again, if you want to be a champion for mental health, you have to be a champion for AOD prevention as well. We know, unfortunately, that there is, it certainly doesn't look like an alcohol or an opiate overdose, but there is an overdose, or at least a severe adverse reaction that we definitely see, where with high doses, people can experience an acute toxic psychosis. For so long, when people started to hallucinate, have out-of-body experiences, be convinced that something was happening that wasn't, delusions, people would say, I wonder if their marijuana was laced with something. High-potency cannabis can cause this. The science shows it's much more likely when a person uses too much or potency is too high. And finally, this article came out in 2017. The title alone is very telling, and I'll say more about that at the end. But they said we want to provide guidelines for lower risk cannabis use, and one of their guidelines was you should not be using if you're actively dealing with psychosis or substance use issues or have a first-degree family history. So there's definitely something going on with mental health and cannabis use. I've been Voldemorting this thing. I don't even want to say its name. It's the virus that shall not be named. Showing off my vast knowledge of literature by quoting Harry Potter. But I'm going to keep Voldemorting it to say, really, couldn't we have just not heard this word for an hour? Well, I would have liked that. However, we went home March 6th, 18 days later. If you went to the National Institute on Drug Abuse website, you were greeted with this statement. Because it attacks the lungs, this issue we've been dealing with could be an especially serious threat to those that smoke tobacco or marijuana or who vape. By July, research out of Stanford University made its way up to my state. My state made this infographic, but you can see the reference to Stanford. What do we know about this virus? Knock on wood, it's been particularly aversive for people with underlying health conditions or older adults. However, there were some young adults that were not only getting it, they were getting it severely. Who are the ones more likely to get it? The ones that are smoking or vaping cannabis or tobacco. And if I draw your attention to the upper right, when those younger people who were vaping were getting it, they were getting it more severely. This came out 3 weeks ago. How's that for a hot off the press study? People that vape, 5 times greater likelihood of being diagnosed positive. Those that vape or smoke, 7 times greater likelihood. If someone says my #1 value, do not get sick, and they currently don't vape or smoke, keep it that way. If they say my #1 goal is don't get sick, and they are making the choice to vape or smoke, if they're ever had a time where they've been contemplating quitting, now's a super good time to do so. Addiction risk. I get asked all the time, is cannabis even addictive? Yes, it is. I mean, you probably hear people say you can't get addicted to weed. That is not true. In previous versions of the DSM, I was trained, when I went through grad school, we had DSM-3R. Then there was DSM-4. Then there was DSM-4 text revision. Then we did the DSM-5 when we bailed on Roman numerals. So take that, Roman numerals. But in the old days, we had, the old days, 2012. In the old days, we had cannabis dependence or cannabis abuse. Now, in the DSM-5, it's a cannabis use disorder, and based on number of symptoms someone endorses, they get a severity rating. I want to say this, and I hope nobody mishears me. If you have a friend, a loved one, a family member with a gravely disabling or potentially lethal condition that's had medical cannabis recommended and are using as recommended, then bless that person. That's not who I'm talking about. But I worry about the 18-year-old who's really depressed and is not willing to talk to a counselor, is not willing to do a consult with a healthcare provider, because they say they want to use medical cannabis instead. That's for two reasons. It's probably for more than two reasons, but for the purposes of this presentation, it's for two reasons. One, the medical community, especially in other countries, is going a very different direction. And two, it could be a case of addiction. I started seeing these headlines as I was preparing to present in Canada. I had the honor of presenting at a conference in Canada 48 hours before they legalized nationwide. And at the time that they were getting ready to legalize nationwide for non-medical purposes, what was amazing is that their medical community was saying, we've got to slow down on medical use. So like any good scientist, I found the original article because people shouldn't get their research from gizmodo.com. And I found the original article. This link will be, or the reference will be in your handouts. If you're like, I don't have time to read 10 pages, okay, then just read figure 1. They said, is someone saying, this great flow chart, is someone saying, I want medical marijuana? If yes, is it for neuropathic pain, palliative or end-of-life pain, chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, or spasticity due to MS or spinal cord injury? If no, then we're done. We're not giving it for sleep, for back pain, for anxiety, for depression, for you name it. Why? There are efficacious treatments out there, or the side effects do not outweigh any potential benefits. And that, of course, is the key to medications. You want the benefits to outweigh the side effects. Only if, yes, have they first tried other treatments, either with no response or just not tolerated. If no, then go back to the drawing board. Only if, yes, they say we recommend a medical cannabinoid as an adjunct, and they make very clear people don't smoke their medicine. So again, I hope no one mishears me. I worry though about, I work with college students, about the college student who's declining counseling for depression, for anxiety, for anger, for someone who's struggling with sleep, with pain, especially if there's an underlying issue that's getting undiagnosed because they say, I just want to use medical cannabis instead. I had a colleague in Massachusetts after they legalized and said, we can't even get people to do therapy for anxiety anymore because they just want to use CBD. Have you seen anything in the published literature about that? This article by Arndt and DeWitt is brilliant. They said, here's the deal. Ethically, if someone's actively dealing with anxiety, we can't take their medication away. That's unethical. But what do we know about us as people? We get upset. We get anxious. I got super anxious right before we started. I'm still a little bit anxious, I'm not going to lie. And so they said, what if we make people anxious? What if we recruit them for a study? They agree to have negative emotional stimuli introduced to them. And they sign a consent form saying, I agree to take a pill that may include CBD. It was a double-blind experiment. What does that mean? You eliminate expectancies. The person taking the pill had no idea what they were taking. The person bringing them the pill didn't know what it was. There was no wink, wink. There was no nothing like that. They got, you can see in the screenshot, when I took a picture of this article, they got one of 4 different things, and they counterbalanced the order because people were their own control groups. They either got a placebo, a sugar pill, or they got 300, 600, or 900 milligrams of CBD orally. When you eliminate expectancies, what did CBD do? Nothing. Again, I hope no one mishears me. I'm not saying CBD does nothing, period. A lot more research needs to be done. But when you don't tell someone this will help with your anxiety, when you take away expectancy, this study suggests, and I'm quoting verbatim, that oral CBD does not alter responses to emotional stimuli or produce anxiolytic-like, what does that mean? Anxiety-reducing-like effects in healthy human subjects. So by now, you're probably thinking to yourself, wow, that Jason guy's got some pretty good stylus skills. And you would be correct. The first time this stylus shot out of my laptop, I was like, what's this? It's a free pen. My colleague is like, that's a stylus. And I was like, thank you. She goes, no, you can use it to draw stuff. And now I'm just that guy who can't be stopped. So to make sure I kept Sue and her team impressed in preparation for this, I drew an orca. I'm really proud of that. I made a velociraptor. Notice the 3 fingers. No T-Rex. Here's a majestic unicorn. This is my friend Amanda's Basset Hound Wilbur. I'm very proud of that. And then I made this for my niece, because there you go. Again, this is brutal. I have no idea if you're all at home saying what's happening right now, or if you found that enjoyable. But Again, I also wonder how many people are reporting medical use that are managing addiction. My friend and colleague, Dr. Christine Lee, asked incoming first-year students, tell us why you use cannabis. And they said, I like the feeling. I like getting high, helps me bond with my friends, gives me something to do when I'm bored, makes things more fun, music sounds better, it's cool, helps me celebrate. But they also said it helps me relax, helps me sleep, lets me cope when I'm depressed, it relieves stress, helps when my appetite sucks, reduces anxiety, alleviates physical pain, helps when I have a headache. Is cannabis addictive? Yes. Are there criteria for cannabis withdrawal? Also yes. What are those criteria? Keeping this list in mind, well, they include anxiety, sleep problems, appetite problems, depressed mood, and headaches. If you've got someone saying, no, I know marijuana helps my depression. If you say, well, how do you know? If they say, I use weed every day, and last week I got sick, I couldn't quit coughing, so I took 3 days off, my depression was terrible. When my cough went away, I started using again, and my depression got better. See, it helps my mood. That's not cannabis use helping your depression. That's resuming substance use, making withdrawal symptoms stop. And in that instance, that's a case of managing addiction, of managing withdrawal, not of managing depressed mood. So if you've got folks that say, I know marijuana helps with any one of these things, because every time I take a day off, I notice these show up, that's a sign of addiction. The students did not in any of these mention number 5, but I'll draw your attention to number 5. A lot of people that say, no, I'm convinced it helps my ADHD, because whenever I take a day off, I can't sit still. That's withdrawal. That's number 5. So. And finally, number 1, driving under the influence. The authors of our initiative set a driving under the influence at 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood for those over 21, any positive amount for those under 21. Why'd they pick 5? It's the same, it's not the same as being drunk, but you see the same impairment in reaction time and the ability to shift focus when there's a lot going on that you see as 0.08 for alcohol. So the million-dollar question is, how long does it take to drop below 5 nanograms? At the time our initiative was written, one published study said 3 hours. As the science evolved, people said 5. The most recent article said people should wait at least 6 hours after use. I don't know how much press this has gotten in Montana, given that it's my state's data, but stores opened in 2014. 1 year later, fatalities with THC present doubled in 1 year in my state. In 2017, we became the first state where drugged driving deaths exceeded drunk driving deaths. And in January of this year, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, this tells one heck of a story. This is not DUIs. This is not enforcement data. This is percentage of drivers involved in fatal crashes who are THC positive. What's the black line? When legalization happened in the state of Washington. So something's clearly going on there. Implications for prevention and lessons learned, not already addressed. I tried to pick a handful. Number 1 is if you happen to work on a college campus, I'd be remiss in not saying nothing should change. And I'll say why. Regardless of if you work on a college campus or not, you've got to have consistent enforcement of laws and policies and be mindful of mixed messages. Why did I say the college campus thing? Every school in the country, 2-year community or technical, 4-year private or public, has to stay compliant with drug-free schools and campus regulations within the Drug-Free Schools and Campuses Act. That's federal, and it says to maintain federal funding, all institutions of higher education have to show that they have a prevention program in place to stop the use and possession of illegal drugs. Since they are federally illegal, independent of what your state does, use, possession, and public use has to remain illegal on campuses. The state of Massachusetts had pinned at the Boston Globe website this human interest story. I was in Boston when this ran in their newspaper, and so I knew to look for it on their website. They flat out ran an article saying, if your school's cracking down, it's because that's what the school has to do to not put funding at risk. But I just want to give you one example, and I'm going to keep this as editorial free as possible. I'm going to let the headlines speak for me. I just put together, this is not me doing creative storytelling. This is me giving you an evolution of some headlines. And this highlights the importance of consistent enforcement. On December 5th, 2012, our election was November 6, 2012. Legalization started 30 days after the election. The Seattle police said officers shall not take any enforcement action other than to issue a verbal warning for a violation of I-502. That was out for about 3 minutes before the second biggest paper in the state of Washington said, getting baked outside, Seattle police to look the other way. That's not what they said. They said they'd give a verbal warning. What was the narrative? Do what you want, the police are gonna look the other way. On the morning of, our biggest NBC affiliate in the state of Washington said 2 things happened today. Use and possession by people over 21 becomes legal, yet public use remains illegal. However, quote, at least for now, Seattle police plan to look the other way in the latter part until people get used to the new law. Other states made fun of us. New Jersey said Seattle police released hilarious statement about legalized marijuana. Seattle police to pot smokers, responsibly get baked, enjoy the Lord of the Rings marathon. The question is, how long does it take for people to get used to the new law? A month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months? By the 9-month mark at the first Hemp Fest post-legalization, Seattle police made the news when they said that they were going to be handing out bags of Doritos to attendees instead of public consumption tickets. They were going to have a sticker that said, we want to remind you of the do's and don'ts and raise awareness of the law. So what happened at Hemp Fest? These were some of the pictures from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. I'm terrible at guessing people's age, but there's no way that person in the upper left is over 21. And so people started saying, is there a mixed message? If there's even a police presence around public use, and certainly around public use by minors, such that, you know, we'll either lose control or that when we do start enforcing, people are going to feel unfairly picked on. So then, after a very bad 420 in 2015, business owners in Seattle went to the mayor at the time and said, you've lost control of downtown Seattle. 3 years ago, people voted on something that said we're going to eliminate the illicit market. Not only is it not eliminated, it's thriving. Seattle has become an open-air drug market. So, quoting directly from the Seattle Times, city officials and business leaders say they're embarking on an ambitious effort to shut down open-air drug dealing and associated crime in Seattle's downtown core with its new 9.5-block strategies. People familiar with Seattle might look at this map and realize that there's Pike Place, Union, and then Macy's in the upper corner. The mayor at the time said, Seattle residents and visitors should not be forced to navigate a dangerous open-air drug market between the downtown retail core and Pike Place Market. I don't know what number of arrests in one afternoon would impress you, but I hope you play at home and think, what number would impress me? What was the goal? Have plainclothes police officers walk those 9.5 blocks, and every time they were offered a drug deal, they would make that deal and then arrest the dealer. This article saying we're going to do a new 9.5-block strategy launched April 25th. 2 days later, how many arrests had been made? 177 purchases from 186 dealers. So there was this sense that, this had really become this open air market. So then the state said stores are starting to open. What were people assured? This will not get in the hands of minors. So they did a very, very soft, heads up everybody, we're going to have 22 stores and we're going to send minors in, make sure that we have 100% compliance and don't sell to minors. 4 of the 22 stores sold to minors. The state said, nope, that's not good enough. We can't do that. We're doing it for real. Next month, 19 of the stores of the 157 at the time still sold to minors. By 2015, we had this article, 20 suspected dealers arrested in U District drug sting. Seattle police arrested 20 alleged drug dealers this week along University Way. 8 of the suspects have been arrested more than 25 times. People that say, what's University Way? This is my campus. The main campus is in green. As we've outgrown our campus, other campus buildings are in black. Where is LiveWell, where people go for support for AOD issues? Right there. Where is University Way? Right there. So to get to where you would get recovery support or help, you were walking by a setting where there were those deals. And finally, there was a question in 2016, did the drug crackdown push crimes elsewhere? The 9.5 block area in blue saw reductions in narcotics calls and a reduction in all calls. The surrounding areas, what did they find? Increases in all of those things. So I show you this to say, if you have consistent enforcement of policy, that's important. Because if there's inconsistent enforcement for years later, there remains some issues with those mixed messages. There remains some issues in terms of what's happening. Screening and brief interventions absolutely show promise. We know I come in because I want a flu shot, you get a screening for alcohol, cannabis use. You look at this thing on my arm, you get a screening. I have a sore throat, you get a screening. Universal screening for quickly assessing use, severity, and risks. Brief interventions using motivational interviewing up to prompt thinking about or commitment to change, referral to treatment when you need them. I'm honored to be a co-author on a study we did with college students where we identified people that were using cannabis in a high-risk way and gave them personalized graphic feedback on their frequency of use, when they used, their perceived and actual norms, reasons for using, consequences they endorsed, symptoms associated with use, family history risk, if they made a change, what they'd expect, and we found significant reductions in amount used. We found significant reductions in time spent high. We even found an effect on consequences or unwanted effects. If you're considering, I didn't know who was going to be on this webinar, and if you're working with youth, you're obviously not going to give messages of harm reduction, but on a college campus, when we're asked to look at harm reduction-based messages, it's important to be aware of recommendations for lower risk rather than low risk use. I mentioned this article and that the title was noteworthy. Lower risk cannabis use guidelines. Why'd they say lower? They said, we looked at the science and we cannot recommend low risk use. Why? Any use incurs risk. Of their 10 recommendations, they said, number one, just abstain from use. Those that decide to use, you need to recognize they incur risks of a variety of acute and long-term adverse health and social outcomes. They say if you make the choice to use, keep your use occasional. How do they define that? A day a week, weekend only. When people say I use every other day, according to harm reduction international researchers, that's pretty frequent use. There's the recommendation to wait at least 6 hours after using before driving. There's the recommendation about not using. If you have a first-degree family history of psychosis or substance use disorders, or predisposition for, or are a pregnant woman. 4, consider event-specific prevention or enforcement. We do know that April 20th is a high-risk event. Bravo and colleagues showed more people use on 4/20 than any other time of the year, more unique sessions of use, and a greater amount. This article looked at data from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and found that if you look at fatal crashes between 4/20 and midnight on April 20th in the same time frame, the previous week and the week after, the risk of a fatal crash is significantly higher on 4/20. So what's the not so good news? There can be some not good things happening on that day. What's the better news? Like, we literally know when that is. You have a 6.5 months head start to plan for what you want your response to be on that day. It almost feels disingenuous to recommend correcting misperceived norms when you have a norms guru and a norms legend in your own state. But there is so much respect for and appreciation of Dr. Jeff Linkenbach and the work he does with his Montana Institute. Our state's Washington Traffic Safety Commission has actually partnered with Dr. Linkenbach to look at the work he does around positive community norms. But what we know is that most people aren't using, no matter what the age group is. Most people aren't driving under the influence. The more people use, the more they think others use. So there is the opportunity for positive community norms, like what Dr. Linkenbach does with his Montana Institute. Using data from our young adult health survey that I'm principal investigator of, Mike Graham Squire and his neighborhood house have been using and doing norms that show that most young adults steer clear. Most are choosing to not use. Most aren't driving after use. What's the concern though? Scribner and colleagues did an amazing study about social norms at 32 schools, and they found overall it didn't work. And so people said, wait, social norms don't work? And there were schools that said it worked at our school. So they looked to do a deeper dive and find were there campuses where it worked and where it worked less well. They found that it did work on campuses with a lower alcohol outlet density. Quoting directly from the article, neon signs, storefront advertising, and direct observation of heavy drinking may convey their own normative message to students, thereby heightening student misperceptions of peer drinking norms. So public use affects norms. Signs all over the place for cannabis stores affect norms. So I show you that because related to that is we have to be aware of the role of media. I was lead author on this article. I have two little brothers. I'm very proud of both. My brother Ryan is a professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. I'm more honored to have published with my little brother than anything I've been a part of. And along with Ryan and my buddy Paul Grossberg at Wisconsin, we reviewed literature that showed that for alcohol, in 12 of 13 studies that showed media exposure of TV, advertisements, movie content, exposure to the media was associated with more initiation of drinking in kids that were normally abstainers, and those that had begun drinking increased consumption. So what does that mean? We have to be mindful of advertisements for cannabis. I blocked out ads so that I'm not, again, I just want to show you this is the type of thing that affects norms in my state. Don't know what to get your loved one for Valentine's Day? Here's a pot ad that took up the bottom half page of our sports page. In my house with 3 boys, we fought over the sports page and comics. Those are the only 2 things we read. So this was in our sports page. If you landed at SeaTac Airport, when University Place hosted the US Open, you were given a guide to the 18 holes. The 19th page was a cannabis ad. These are in the magazines that are in hotels in Seattle, Seattle Magazine and Seattle Metropolitan Magazine, as you work your way to the centerfold, which is a centerfold that shows all the stores where you can get retail cannabis. I'm a big fan of 80s music because I'm awesome, and 80s music is the best. And so I was watching, I don't sign into YouTube. It doesn't know how old I am. It only knows where I'm watching. But I was listening to the live version of Africa by Toto. It's a good song. And I had to watch the ad. It was a pop-up pot ad in my state. This is the 420 edition of our local newspaper. It had an insert with word finds, a coloring contest, a super easy maze, and a find the difference game. Part of the deal with advertising is it wasn't supposed to appeal to kids. A lot of that seems that might not be the case here. Our state launched a big parent-based campaign called Teens Under the Influence of You, starttalkingnow.org. On the day this launched, on March 16th, 2017, if you scroll down, there was a article, a human interest story, personalize your French toast with cannabis, spices, and toppings. Want to read further? Holiday food, wine, and cannabis pairings. That's actually a drug interaction that we work really hard to make sure people avoid. I saw this, cannabis kale chips that will make your weekend. No one's ever used the word kale and make your weekend in the same sentence ever. So I think that's important to note. My mom is on Pinterest. I'm on no social media. My mom's hilarious because she keeps forwarding me things. She sent me this, and I told her I would show it. It said, pro tip, if you stir coconut oil into your kale, it makes it easier to scrape into the trash. So I think that's funny. Thanks, Mom. 6, do increase risk perception and support prevention intervention efforts that could impact motivation to change. And 7, absolutely utilize parents as partners in prevention. This is not data I've collected. This comes from our state's Healthy Youth Survey. Hey, high school sophomores, do you think your parents think it's wrong for you to use marijuana or it's not wrong? When sophomores think that their parents would think it's wrong for them to use, 13% have used in the last 30 days. When kids say, my parents don't care, 59% have used in the last 30 days. I told you I'm principal investigator of our state's Young Adult Health Survey. When we ask 18 and 18 and 20-year-olds who report marijuana use, where do you get it? We've seen a statistically significant trend decreasing over time, getting it from friends and getting it from medical sources since the medical market closed in my state. But a significant increasing trend in giving money to someone, getting it from family, or getting it from parents with their permission. I don't know if those parents are unaware of the mental health concerns, if they're unaware of academic impacts, or if they're operating off of an old script and think it's just weed. But this is, parents have to be partners in prevention. And finally, remember, any one thing you do is part of an overall puzzle. We got a little bit of a late start. That was 143 slides. Boom. If it felt like 143 slides, my sincere apologies. If it did not, I hope I kept this fast moving. I hope this met your needs and interests. I will again thank Sue. That's my email address and the Velociraptor again. And we're on Twitter. Our lab is really excited about that. So if you feel compelled to either check us out, follow us, or even tweet about this and give us a @ we would be super happy about that. So with that, I will stop talking. I will invite Sue to unmute. And I will open it up for however Sue would like to run the Q&A part of this.